ancient mass grave in modern-day Kenya that they say proves human warfare is really old. At least 10,000 years old, to be exact.
Everyone assumes ancient Egypt is the oldest chapter of human history in the Nile Valley, rising from primitive hunter-gatherers into the age of pharaohs. It's not. Hard forensic data now proves a lost civilization existed in that valley over 10,000 years ago, violently erased by a catastrophic event reaching 2,200 degrees Celsius. As of 2025, biological evidence confirms the dynastic Egyptians were an entirely different population built on top of those ashes. So what exactly triggered this total biological purge? The First Resource War. The bones told the story before anyone thought to look closely enough. Long before the pharaohs, long before the first hieroglyph was scratched into stone, a people called the Kadan were living along the Nile in a way that should sound familiar. They weren't wandering nomads. They were semi-sedentary, meaning they'd largely stopped moving and started settling, building semi-permanent camps and harvesting wild grains from the riverbanks thousands of years before agriculture officially began in the historical record. They were, by any reasonable definition, proto-civilized, and they were already fighting desperately to survive. The evidence lives in a burial site called Cemetery 117, located at Jebel Sahaba in what is now northern Sudan. When researchers first excavated it in the 1960s, they found 61 skeletons and noted signs of trauma, violent deaths, projectile wounds. But the original analysis only scratched the surface, literally. In May 2021, Dr. Isabelle Crevecoeur of the Université de Bordeaux went back to those same bones with modern microscopic analysis tools, examining the skeletal material at a level of detail the original excavators simply couldn't access. What she found completely rewrote what we thought we knew about this burial site. Across those 61 skeletons, her team documented 106 previously unrecorded lesions, wounds so small or so subtly positioned that earlier researchers had missed them entirely. And 41 of those 61 individuals, roughly 67%, showed clear evidence of projectile injuries, the kind left by stone-tipped spears and arrows fired at close range. But here's what makes this finding genuinely different from a typical ancient massacre site. The injuries weren't all fresh. Some wounds had partially healed, showing bone regrowth around the damage, which means those individuals survived an earlier attack, recovered, and then died in a subsequent one. Others showed no healing at all, meaning they died from their wounds immediately. The same skeletons carried both types. That combination, healed injuries layered on top of unhealed ones, is the forensic signature of recurrent, ongoing warfare. Not a single catastrophic battle, not a raid, a sustained, grinding, desperate conflict that played out over years, maybe generations. If these early Nile Valley inhabitants were already settling down and harvesting crops, what could have forced them into such a desperate, bloody fight for survival? The answer is resources, specifically the violent contraction of them. The Kadan culture's timeline places them right at the edge of one of the most catastrophic climate events in human prehistory, the onset of the Younger Dryas, a sudden, severe global cooling that began approximately 12,800 years ago. As temperatures plummeted and rainfall patterns collapsed, the fertile strips of the Nile Valley, the same strips that had supported semi-sedentary grain cultivation, began to shrink. The study published in Scientific Reports by Dr. Crevecoeur's team connects this violence directly to that environmental pressure. Competing groups, all dependent on the same narrowing corridor of viable land, turned on each other as the world around them fell apart. This wasn't tribal savagery. This was rational desperation. When the food supply collapses, you fight for what's left. The Cemetery 117 skeletons aren't evidence of a brutal culture. They're evidence of a thriving culture being squeezed to death by a climate event they had no framework to understand and no way to stop. The archaeological record clearly shows that a shifting climate forced these early inhabitants into a ruthless resource war, desperately clinging to the last fertile strips of the Nile. But natural climate cycles take thousands of years to drastically alter a landscape. To push a thriving, semi-sedentary culture into a sudden 1,200-year deep freeze requires an immediate, violent catalyst. What was this smoking gun catalyst? The 2,200-degree flashpoint. The catalyst wasn't gradual. It arrived in a single moment, and it left physical proof. Abu Hureyra was a settlement in what is now northern Syria, one of the earliest known sites where humans transitioned from foraging to farming. By 12,800 years ago, people there were cultivating crops, living in permanent structures, and by all archaeological indicators, thriving. Then something happened that coated their building materials and the bones of their animals in glass. Not metaphorical glass, actual glass, fused directly onto organic and inorganic material at temperatures that have no business existing at ground level. In March 2020, Dr. James Kennett of UC Santa Barbara led a research team publishing their findings in scientific reports detailing what they recovered from the Abu Hureyra site. Scattered throughout the early occupation layers, they found melt glass, a substance formed when temperatures get so extreme that the surrounding material liquefies and then rapidly re-solidifies. That alone would be alarming. But the geochemical composition of this glass is what makes it impossible to explain away. The Abu Hureyra melt glass contains melted quartz, chromphoride, and magnetite, three minerals with very different melting points that had been simultaneously fused together into a single glassy matrix. Melting quartz alone requires temperatures above 1,720 degrees Celsius. Chromphoride pushes that requirement even higher, with the full mineral assemblage demanding temperatures between 1,720 and 2,200 degrees Celsius to simultaneously liquefy. For reference, the surface of molten steel sits at roughly 1,500 degrees Celsius. An automobile, given enough heat, melts in under a minute at 1,200 degrees. Whatever hit Abu Hureyra was burning nearly twice that hot. Now, critics immediately raised the obvious alternatives: volcanic activity, lightning strikes, and large-scale wildfires. Dr. Kennett's team addressed each one directly. Natural wildfires, even catastrophic ones, max out well below 1,000 degrees Celsius. Volcanic ejecta can reach high temperatures but leaves a distinctive magnetic signature in the surrounding sediment that simply isn't present at Abu Hureyra. Lightning-fused glass, called fulgurites, has a completely different physical structure and chemical fingerprint. None of the alternative explanations produce a mineral assemblage like the one found splashed across those bones and building stones. The only known mechanism that generates simultaneous multi-mineral fusion at 1,720 to 2,200 degrees Celsius at or near ground level is an airburst, a fragmented comet detonating in the atmosphere, which by 12,800 years ago was already the leading hypothesis for what triggered the Younger Dryas. Dr. Kennett's Abu Hureyra data wasn't just consistent with that hypothesis, it was the first direct physical evidence of where and how hot that event burned. And the Khadan people fighting over the Nile's shrinking resources, remember them from Cemetery 117, were living through the downstream consequences of exactly this moment. The airburst didn't just destroy Abu Hureyra, it triggered a cascade: massive wildfires, atmospheric dust clouds, the destabilization of ice sheets, and ultimately the 1,200-year global cooling event that starved out entire cultures across the Northern Hemisphere. How does a semi-sedentary civilization survive an event that rains down liquid glass at temperatures hot enough to instantly melt steel? The honest answer is, most of them didn't. Dr. Kennett's team proved that an atmospheric comet detonation plunged the Northern Hemisphere into a sudden, apocalyptic winter. Yet for decades, mainstream critics completely dismissed this Younger Dryas impact theory with one seemingly bulletproof argument. If a massive comet actually broke apart over the Earth, where is the evidence at the bottom of the ocean? The ocean core proof. The ocean floor had been holding the answer for 12,800 years. Nobody had looked in the right place until now. For years, the most persistent objection to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis was straightforward. The evidence kept turning up on land. Sites in Syria, North America, Europe, and the Middle East all showed the same impact markers at the same geological boundary. But critics argued that land-based evidence is vulnerable to contamination, misidentification, and local variables. What they demanded was something harder to argue with: deep marine sediment cores pulled from the ocean floor, where conditions are stable, where layers accumulate undisturbed over millennia, and where a true global event would leave an unmistakable chemical fingerprint. In August 2025, Dr. Christopher R. Moore of the University of South Carolina and his team published exactly that in PLOS 1. 4 deep marine sediment cores were extracted from Baffin Bay, the body of water sitting between Greenland and the Canadian Arctic archipelago. That location matters. Baffin Bay is geographically remote from every land-based impact site previously studied. There's no reasonable mechanism for terrestrial contamination to reach those sediment layers. Whatever showed up in those cores got there from the atmosphere, and what showed up was unambiguous. At the precise sediment layer corresponding to 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas boundary, all 4 cores showed synchronous abundance peaks of metallic cometary dust and nanoparticles enriched with platinum, iridium, nickel, and cobalt. Synchronous, meaning the spike happened simultaneously across all 4 cores, which were pulled from different locations within the bay. The platinum group elements, particularly platinum and iridium, are vanishingly rare in Earth's crust, but are characteristic signatures of extraterrestrial material. Their presence in concentrated, simultaneous peaks at the exact 12,800-year boundary is not something gradual climate change produces. Volcanoes don't do it. Ocean chemistry shifts don't do it. A cometary impact does. Now here's where it gets interesting. The ocean cores don't just confirm the impact. They help explain the mechanism of the climate collapse that followed. The Younger Dryas wasn't just cold. It was abrupt in a way that purely atmospheric effects can't fully account for. The Baffin Bay location points directly at what likely happened next. The impact destabilized massive North American ice sheets, triggering a catastrophic meltwater pulse into the North Atlantic. That freshwater surge disrupted thermohaline circulation, which is essentially the ocean's global conveyor belt system that distributes heat across the planet. Shut that down, and you get the 1,200-year deep freeze that turned the Nile Valley from a productive, semi-inhabited landscape into a killing field. If the oceanic data now confirms a catastrophic global impact at 12,800 years ago, how much of human history was completely reset in the aftermath? The scope is almost difficult to process. Every culture that existed in the Northern Hemisphere at that moment was either devastated or destroyed. The Kardon people of Cemetery 117 were one data point in a global extinction of pre-civilizational societies. The Baffin Bay cores permanently closed the debate on how the climate collapsed. So the antediluvian world was undeniably shattered by a cosmic impact. But proving a comet hit the Earth is only half the puzzle. What exactly happened to the surviving pre-Egyptian civilization that was already cultivating the Nile Valley when the sky fell? The biological purge. Teeth don't lie. And these ones proved that the people who built the pyramids were strangers to the land they built them on. The standard assumption in Egyptology has always been one of cultural continuity. The hunter-gatherers and semi-sedentary cultivators of the pre-dynastic Nile Valley gradually evolved over thousands of years into the civilization that raised the great monuments. The story we tell is one of slow accumulation of knowledge and culture passing down through generations until it crystallized into pharaonic Egypt. That story, as of March 2025, is forensically broken. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences took a different approach to the question of Egyptian origins. Instead of looking at artifacts or architecture, researchers examined the one biological record that preserves population-level data across millennia with extraordinary precision: the internal geometry of teeth. Specifically, they used X-ray microtomography to analyze what's called the enamel-dentine junction, or EDJ. The EDJs is the boundary layer between the outer enamel of a tooth and the dentine beneath it, and its three-dimensional shape is largely controlled by genetics. Unlike the outer surface of a tooth, which gets worn down by diet and environment over a lifetime, the EDJ's morphology is set during tooth development and doesn't change. It's essentially a genetic fossil embedded in every tooth, and its shape clusters predictably within related populations. The researchers scanned the dental remains of 88 individuals spanning 14,000 years of Nile Valley occupation, from pre-cataclysm hunter-gatherers all the way through to dynastic Egyptians. The result was what the study described directly as a major biological discontinuity. That phrase is doing a lot of work, so let's be precise about what it means. The EDJ morphology of the pre-Younger Dryas population clustered in one distinct pattern. The EDJ morphology of the dynastic Egyptians clustered in an entirely different pattern. There was no gradual transition between them, no blending, no evidence of the genetic mixing you'd expect if one population slowly absorbed or evolved into another. The biological data shows two completely separate populations, separated by the precise window of the Younger Dryas collapse. If the people who built the pyramids had no biological connection to the original inhabitants, whose ruins were they actually building on top of? That question has no comfortable answer. What we do know is that the pre-cataclysm population wasn't absorbed. They didn't intermarry with newcomers and gradually fade. The gene pool itself was replaced completely by a population that migrated into the Nile Valley thousands of years after the cosmic reset and built their civilization on land that had been emptied by catastrophe. We now have absolute proof that a completely different civilization lived, fought, and died in the Nile Valley before a cosmic impact wiped them from the genetic record. But this raises a glaring, impossible question. If an advanced, semi-sedentary civilization existed before this 12,800-year-old reset, why haven't archaeologists found their temples, monoliths, or cities beneath the sands of Egypt? The 36-foot grave. The ruins aren't missing. They're buried under 11 meters of mud, and we've been standing on top of them the entire time. When archaeologists go looking for pre-dynastic structures in Egypt, they dig down to the layers that correspond to the right time period, find nothing, and conclude there was nothing to find. But a geomorphological survey of the Nile Valley, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, reveals exactly why that logic is catastrophically wrong. The research team worked with 26 sediment cores drilled from across the Nile floodplain, dating each layer using optically stimulated luminescence, a technique that measures how long ago sediment grains were last exposed to sunlight before being buried. Think of it like a geological clock. When sediment gets deposited and covered, it starts accumulating a measurable radiation signal. Analyze that signal, and you can determine with considerable precision exactly when each layer was laid down. What the cores revealed is a two-phase story of extreme geological violence followed by slow burial. In the early to middle Holocene, the period immediately following the Younger Dryas catastrophe, the Nile didn't flow calmly. It calved, freed from the climate constraints that had frozen its upper watershed. The river began deeply incising its valley, cutting downward with far greater energy than it carries today, scouring the floodplain and stripping away whatever had been built on its banks. That phase alone would have obliterated most surface structures from the pre-impact culture. Then came the burial. As the climate stabilized and the African monsoon strengthened around 4,000 years ago, the river's behavior shifted from incision to deposition. Floodwaters spread laterally across the valley each year, dropping their sediment loads as they receded. Layer by layer, year by year, the Nile built up its own floodplain from scratch. By the time the process was complete, 11 meters of overbank sediment, roughly 36 feet, had accumulated across the valley floor. To put that in physical terms, a three-story building standing on the pre-impact surface would be completely invisible today, its roofline still sitting several feet below the current ground level. Any structure built from mud brick, wood, or even modest stonework would be undetectable without extremely deep, precisely targeted excavation. The only things that would survive are features carved directly into bedrock at the highest points of the ancient landscape, elevated enough to sit above the sediment column. And that's exactly what the Sphinx enclosure looks like. The core body of the Sphinx isn't built, it's carved, cut directly from the living limestone of the Giza Plateau. If a pre-impact population carved anything into that bedrock plateau before the cataclysm, it would be the one category of structure the subsequent 11 meters of sediment couldn't erase. This perfectly aligns with the controversial water erosion hypothesis first proposed by geologists in the 1990s. The deep vertical fissures on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure were not caused by wind and sand, but by thousands of years of torrential rainfall. Dynastic Egypt never experienced that kind of sustained, heavy precipitation. But the exact period immediately following the Younger Dryas impact absolutely did. As the global climate violently shifted, extreme pluvial rains pounded the region. The original inhabitants likely carved the monument only for catastrophic climate shifts to weather it before the mud buried all surrounding physical evidence. The geological record confirms what the biological and cosmic data already told us. The ancient Egyptian empire we marvel at today is just the top layer of a massive buried crime scene. The real story of human civilization doesn't start with the pharaohs. It ends with them building their monuments on top of a 10,000-year-old graveyard. A lost antediluvian civilization existed before Egypt, fought brutal resource wars as a comet tore the sky apart, and then vanished so completely that 2025 dental scans were required to prove they ever existed at all. The deep-sea cometary dust from Baffin Bay confirmed the reset. The enamel dentine junction data confirmed the replacement, and 36 feet of Nile sediment confirmed the burial. Could the Sphinx be a surviving bedrock relic of that original wiped-out population? If this landed differently than you expected, leave a comment below. Ciao.